Good evening and welcome to our third session of the virtual Deertrails Naturalist program. My name is Diana Stenberg and I'm TLC's Deputy Executive Director. Our Deertrails Naturalist program was first launched in 2019 in the Clearwater River Valley, where TLC protects more than 140 acres of meadow, wetlands, and forests. The program was designed to provide opportunities for the transfer of naturalist knowledge between generations. Unfortunately, we had to cancel our in-person Deertrails Naturalist program this year, but we are thankful to our volunteer instructors for offering these virtual sessions. One of our guest instructors will be sharing with us tonight. Nancy Turner is a renowned ethnobotanist. Nancy has worked with Indigenous elders and communities to further document and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and habitats. She's authored and edited over 30 books, including Plants of Haida Gwaii, The Earth's Blanket, Food Plants of Coastal First Peoples, and more than 150 chapters and papers. Her chosen topic tonight is Plants as Our Relatives, Kincentricity, and Ways of Knowing. Please welcome Nancy Turner.
Okay. Well, this is sort of a hybrid talk in a way. I started a talk called Knowing Home about home place. And then I saw that I was advertised as talking about kincentricity. And so I kind of made a slideshow that combines those two concepts in a way. I want to start, though, by recognizing the Coast Salish peoples here on Vancouver Island, where I'm living, the Saanich in particular, and the Cowichan, Snuneymuxw, and the other Coast Salish peoples, as well as Secwepemc peoples up in the Clearwater area, where Trevor and some of you are located in the Kamloops area, and all of the Indigenous peoples in British Columbia and beyond. And to acknowledge their teachings, which I've been really devoting a lot of my lifetime of research learning from them. I want to thank all of you who are here and all those who have contributed to this series. And some years ago, I had the privilege of hiking up at Trophy Mountain, which is very near where Trevor is. And it's such a beautiful area. I had to put a photo in of that. So as I mentioned, I've spent a good part of my life learning from amazing knowledge holders from different First Nations, mostly here in British Columbia. And I just want to acknowledge them. And I'll be talking about some of their teachings as we go through. But I'll just quickly go through these folks. There are some of many others, but some key teachers of mine. Sam Mitchell from the Slatleymuk Nation in Lillooet. Kim Rakamakludacy from the Kwakwakkwak Nation, and her late husband, Clan Chief Adam Dick, also from Kwakwakkwak. Joan Morris, who Trevor and others of you know from her visit up to Clearwater some years ago now, Setlama. For Newholt Grannies, Dr. Margaret Saiwalis, Elsie Jacobs, Alice Talio, and Felicity Wakas. Dr. Mary Thomas, who I'll be talking about quite a bit. Dr. Lucy Marvid Charlie. Doctors Ron and Marianne Ignace, from some years ago when their youngest was a baby. And Key Iljuice, Barbara Wilson, my Haida sister. Elsie Claxton from the Saanich Nation. Dr. Richard Atleo from the Nutanos Nation. The late Chief Ernie Hill from Hartley Bay, Kitkat Nation. Dr. Daisy Seward Smith, Mayanil, from the Kwakwakkwak Nation, and Ida Jones from the Pacheedaht Nation. So these are just a few of the folks who've shared their knowledge with me, and I'm now sharing with you. And some of you might know that we have a new book out. I just thought I'd put it up there. It came out in September and it sold out before Christmas. So it's into its second printing, which should be out soon, but it features the knowledge of Dr. Lucy Marvin Charley, who is an amazing man who learned so much from his own great-grandfather, whose name was Lucy as well. And since we're talking about home place, I want to recognize that a lot of the thinking that and the ideas that I'm talking about are also held in other places and other people in the world. So not just Indigenous people, but even the people who founded the subject of ecology recognize the interrelationships that we have with the natural world. And especially in this case, Ernest Haeckel talked about the relation of the animal, both to its organic as well as its inorganic environment. And of course, home place ecology comes from oikos, which means household or home place. Some of you know this wonderful book by Stan Rowe from many years ago now. And ethnoecology is a derivative of ecology, but also derived from ethnobiology, the study of the cultural, ecological knowledge and interactions between human societies and their environments. So we could say place-based or situated knowledge. And of course, it ties, ethnoecology ties in with knowledge for conservation, knowledge for restoration, and how we can live sustainably within our environments, providing different models and different ideas about how we can do this. And of course, plants have home places too. We mustn't forget them. It's very easy to focus on animals because they might be seen as more charismatic, but to me, plants are charismatic too. And they have their own home places. So that brings me to the subject of the title, Kincentricity, which is really a term that was created by, some of you know, Dennis Martinez from the ecological restoration area. He's an Indigenous ethnobiologist, and he was the one who originally coined this term, kincentricity. But what it is the view that humans and nature are all part of an extended family, and we all share common ancestry and origins, and we're all related to each other. And if we recognize that, that is the kincentricity. And so when we talk about caring for our home, we should be talking about caring for the homes of all species, all our relations. Dr. Enrique Salmon, another dear friend from the Raramuri Nation, another ethnobiologist, also writes about kincentricity and Awigura, which is a term in his own Raramuri language that is about the total interconnectedness and integration of all life in the area where he originates, but otherwise as well. People who hold a concentric view of the world regard all the Earth's beings as relatives, different in form but not in substance to our humans selves. And so Awigura, the concept, is about this interconnectedness, and it's about the obligations that humans have towards our family, our kin, both plant and animal, and we could say add fungi to that as well, fungi and lichens, that we have responsibilities to these other life forms, just as we do to our own relatives in the human world. So for the Raramuri and others, raramuri. Everything that breathes or respires has a soul. Plants, animals, humans, stones, the land, all of these share the same breath. They all have souls. And this is reflected in language. And this is just one example in the Sanchathan language. The names, the spiritual names for the different kinds of salmon are actually relate to relationships. So a coho salmon is called in the first salmon ceremony, the name that means the parent of your daughter-in-law or son-in-law, and the pink salmon, an adopted niece or nephew, and the Chinook, sister-in-law or brother-in-law. Sakai is the honored one. And so these reflect the respect that people hold for these different species of salmon. And we also see this in the languages many of us descend from long ago in European history. For example, in Scandinavian languages, the name for oak is derived from an ancient Norse word that really implies reverence and respect. So that's where oak comes from. So when you look at an oak tree, think about that our own ancestors, if we're from European ancestry, had this reverence for oaks and other trees and other forms of life. And just a few examples here from the Cherokee Nation. My friend Jeff Corntassel, who's UVic prof, talks about how bears are brothers. And this is a strong tradition, so strong that you would never think about eating a bear. It would be like eating a fellow Cherokee. In Guatemala, this also pertains to domesticated crop plants as well. The corn for Mayan farmers is seen as like our mother. And that's reflected in the care that people take with their corn and the ceremonies around how they prepare the fields and plant and harvest the corn. So Dr. Mary Thomas was one of my very dear friends and teachers, and she talked a lot about the relationships that her people had with nature. And so she talked about her little grandmother. I watched her when we were little. She went to gather medicine. She didn't go tramping in the woods and just chop, chop or dig, dig. I could hear my little grandmother. She'd be chanting a tune as we're going along. And when she went up to a tree or a shrub, she acknowledged that particular tree like it was a human being. And you see Mary herself talking to a red osier dogwood bush that she was going to harvest a branch from to make medicine from the inner bark. She was going to show us how to do that, and made some medicine for the grandson of one of my other friends, Mabel Joe. And it's also, the kincentricity is reflected in the stories of First Nations. So many stories have as the main characters plants and animals, actors in their human form. For example, the Heshquit story about the Cedar Sisters. These three young women were out processing their salmon, and along came Raven, and he thought, I want some of that salmon. And he sidled up to them and he said, "Hi, girls, how are you doing?" And that sort of thing. And he said, "Aren't you afraid of being here on your own?" And they said, "No." "Aren't you afraid of bears?" "No." "Aren't you afraid of wolves?" "No, we're not afraid of wolves." And then Raven thought, and he said, "Aren't you afraid of owls?" And they said, "Don't talk to us about owls. We're really afraid of owls." And then they talked a little while longer, and Raven went on his way, but he didn't go very far. He hid behind a tree, and then he started to call, "Ooh, ooh." And when those young women heard the owl calling, they started to run. They dropped everything and they started to run, and they ran halfway up the mountainside. And by that time they were so tired, they said, "We can't go any further. Sisters, let's stop here." And they turned themselves into yellow cedar trees. And that's why yellow cedar has beautiful, long, silky inner bark and long hanging branches, because these young women were beautiful and had long hanging hair. That story was told to me by Alice. Alice from Heshquit. And I'm sorry, all of a sudden my brain has stopped and I can't think of her last name, but I'll think of it in a moment. And so we see, this is her sister here, Jessie Sy. I can remember her name, one of the Curtis photos taken of Alice's sister. And we see Ashley Sandy here, who did study yellow cedar up at Hartley Bay. Nani Florence Davidson's yellow cedar bark hat. Sorry, Alice Paul. And other stories as well. There's a couple of stories from different nations about the spiny wood fern, Dryopteris expansa. One was an old blind woman from the Lillooet Nation. She was blind, and she allowed somebody to kidnap her grandson because she couldn't see them. And when her husband got home, he was so angry with her. He took her and stuck her in head first into a rotten log, and she became the spiny wood fern. And another one, equally sad and disturbing, is a little orphan girl from the Tlingit area who was caught in an avalanche, and she was severed in two, and half of her became a marmot and the bottom half of her became a wood fern. And wood fern is an important crest as well for the Gitxsan Nation. And people all over remember their ancestors eating the rootstocks after they were pit cooked, although not too many people know about it. It's being edible today. Another story from the Newhalt Nation recorded by Thomas McElraith was about a woman who was out picking berries, and she was eating them while she was picking, and she heard people calling her foul-mouthed. And she wondered who that was, and she peered up into the brush above where she was, and she saw this host of goggle-eyed little boys sitting on the berry branches, and they were laughing at her because she was picking the berries. So she learned that you're not supposed to pick the berry, you're not supposed to eat the berries when you're picking the berries. And she never did that again. But imagine those goggle-eyed little boys sitting on the berry bushes. Devil's Club is very, very important culturally all throughout its range, and it's personified in many stories. Devil's Club man is well known in stories as a character, and this is my friend Barb Wilson's brother, Kinjawas, now hereditary chief of the Kamchua clan of Haida, Ron Wilson, who did this painting for Plants of Haida Gwaii, the book that we put out. And this is for Trevor, of course. There's a wonderful Silich Okanagan story about how the black tree lichen was created from Coyote when he got caught up in a tree. He was some swans were kidnapping his son, and he was up in the tree getting some branches, and the swans flew off with his son. And he tried to get down, and he got his hair braid caught in the branches. And after a while, he got down, he fell down, and he looked up and he said, "You shall not be wasted, my valuable hair. Henceforth, I'm going to turn you into the black moss, the black tree lichen, so, and you'll be food for the people." So that's a story that goes with this really important lichen that is indeed, has been an important food, as our friend Stu Crawford wrote about in his master's thesis with Trevor's help. There's another, even the tree fungus has a persona in a Haida story on the origin of women, and it's depicted in this argillite plate, the original of which was carved by Charles Edenshaw, but later by his grandson. A replica was made by his grandson, Claude Davidson. And that's what the tree fungus looks like as a steersman in Raven's canoe. And of course, these all of these kincentric belief systems are tied into the way the land is treated and the way resources are treated. And so this is from, this is the quote that inspired my book, The Earth's Blanket, from the unpublished field notes of James Tate. "Flowers, plants, and grass, especially the latter, are the covering or blanket of the earth. If too much plucked or ruthlessly destroyed, earth sorry and weeps. It rains, or is angry and makes rain, fog, and bad weather." So that's just part of this overall perspective of how important all these species are and how they need to be treated with respect. And some years ago now, Bob Bendringas, another ethnobotanist, did his master's work on bitterroot and the ethnobotany, especially working with Ntlakatmuch knowledge holders. And these are some of the phrases that are given as the bitterroot, the persona, the kwapan are sitting. They're holding hands. They talk to one another. They're hiding from you. You're going to make them upset. That's if children are misbehaving, they're told that you're going to make the kwapan, the bitterroot, upset, and we won't be able to find any. And it's also considered a good luck charm. There's my friend, the late Selena Tamoyakan from the Okanagan Nation, looking at bitterroot. And it's reflected in the ethnographic writings as well. This is from Edward Curtis, talking about how important, how careful people were when they were harvesting from trees, and they wouldn't kill them needlessly. And they'd talk to the tree, just like Mary was talking to the red osier dogwood. And the word for that tree when it's being asked for help is called begged from. And since trees are believed to be sentient, they would talk to the tree and say they've come to beg for a piece of it, whether it's a cedar bark or a yew tree or whatever. And the tree would only be cut down if the entire thing was needed, but otherwise people made a practice of very carefully keeping those trees alive. And here's Roy Hyupis from New Channel, who is on the Clayoquot scientific panel, talking about cutting a tree for a canoe. And Joe Martin and other canoe makers would say the same thing. Talk to it like a person. Explain why you need to use the tree, why you want to use it. And it may, he said, it may seem like you're praying to the tree, but you're praying to the creator, but you're acknowledging the tree as a living being. As Helen Clifton from Hartley Bay says, they all have their societies, they all have their families. She's talking about the plants and animals. You have to respect them, whether it's a plant, a little mouse, or a wolf, any living creature. And of course, this perspective of living things promotes conservation. Like my friend Pauline Waterfall says, all living things have a spirit life. We acknowledged and still do that every life is worthy of being respected. Oops. Oh, I don't know how that happened, but, and my friend Satlama, she says, you have to sing to the trees. Richard Atleo, again, who is the co-chair of the Claquet panel, talks again about how so much respect is given, not just to the tree when one is hoping to cut a tree for a canoe, but you would visit the plants around the tree, even the little plants, before focusing on the tree itself, and talk to them and tell them what you plan to do. Ask permission. In reciprocity, giving, taking, and transformation. Mary Thomas again, she talks about how she was so careful, and her grandmother and all the others who harvested birch bark or cherry bark were always so careful just to cut into the outer layer of the bark. So if you cut right through, the sap will start to come out and you deprive the tree of the sap. Once the bark is taken off, it will not grow back, but that pulp will turn into a hard surface, and that protects the tree. It keeps the tree alive. So the life of a birch tree matters. And she also talked about how her mother, Christine Allen, was always so careful to thank for whatever she received, even a handful of strawberries. She would receive them and hold them up and say, thank you, thank you, thank you, to show respect and appreciation. So all of these practices are tied in with the way people looked after and cared for and managed the plants and animals and the land. And there's even a word for that in the Kwakwala language, told to us by Clan Chief Adam Dick, keeping it living. That word, and I hesitate to pronounce it because I don't want to say it wrong, but that's what it means. It translates keeping it living. And that was the title of another book that Douglas Doerr and I co-edited about these management practices, how people were careful working with natural processes like nutrient cycling and regeneration, and succession, ecological succession, underpinned by the worldviews and beliefs and the care and the respect that they held for the species that people used. And even things like the use of fire was done with great care, and working again with natural processes like nutrient recycling and ecological succession, pruning and coppicing trees and shrubs, or just partially removing a piece of bark so that it will grow over naturally. The same with harvesting cedar bark. So all of these are long-standing practices that go back for countless generations, and you can see the evidence of this when you look up and down the coast and in the interior as well. You can find trees, some of which have had a piece of bark taken from them 500 years ago. They're called culturally modified trees. And you can see, here's Captain Gold. He's showing 2 cedar trees, one that had a strip taken from it, probably maybe 30 to 50 years ago. And then one he took a strip from very recently. And here and around the Gitkata seaweed camp at Kiel, this tree shows where somebody took a piece of bark about 100 years ago, maybe. So all the ways that people kept the plants going and the populations going, replanting, scattering, and transplanting propagules. And we have a new paper out in American Anthropologist, my friend Dana Leposki and Cheryl Armstrong. And it's called Adopting a Root, and it's about how people transplanted and translocated plants all over the place around British Columbia, and the evidence for it, from language to linguistic to archaeological to ethnographic evidence, phytogeographical evidence. And just one small example of how people cared for these plants was what Adam told me back in 1996. As a little boy, he went down to the Tequila root gardens in the mouth of the Kincentricity estuary. And his job was to take off the little propagule at the bottom of the rice root plant. And they call it the gagump. And gagump means grandparent, grandfather, which shows how closely all of this kincentricity is tied in. And so he said, that was my job as a kid when I was with the old people, to put those little sprouts back into the ground, and also to leave a few of the little bulblets behind. And that was a way to keep this population living. And meanwhile, up in the Schwetmuck area, Mary Thomas talked about something very similar that she did with her mother and grandmother, was to remove the little, what they call the whiskers from the bottom of the glacier lily, and put them back in the ground. The same thing. You had to clip that off and throw it back in the soil where it was growing so it would grow back again. So they were very careful about these things. The use of fire, as I mentioned, was a way to keep certain plants productive, to keep open areas and open clearings, and to prevent the catastrophic fires that we've been seeing since landscape burning of this scale was banned back in the time of the birth of Smokey the Bear in the early 1900s. And you find places all around the province where people have practiced all of these different management methods together. And you find these constellations of crabapple stands and root gardens and berry gardens and culturally modified cedar trees, stinging nettle patches that have been planted out, such as this one on North Hunter Island in Heiltsuk territory. And the mountain there, Monskomotli, it's at the base of that mountain. And what's happened now, we see all over and over again, this knowledge and the experience, the practices of First Nations were largely unseen by the European newcomers. And they didn't see the people here as looking after the land in any civilized way. And that's a quote from one of the colonists, Gilbert Sproat. And so they ended up replacing a lot of the native habitat, not just with the buildings, but with grass, meadows, introduced species. And just one example, the springbank clover, which used to occur around the coastline of Victoria, and Clover Point is named after that species. You can't find clover around the Victoria waterfront anymore. Well, maybe just in one or two secret locations. So these are all the things. I don't need to tell you about them. We've heard enough about them, even in the news these days, about the residential schools, the assumption of superiority by the newcomers, the banning of burning and and fish traps and traditional practices, which were actually very carefully developed management practices, and resulting in a lot of destruction, a lot of loss of species. As Daisy says, it's unreal. This is our country, but you'd think we'd become aliens in our own land. And it's led to a lot of ecological grief for Indigenous people. Going way back in the McKenna-McBride hearings back in the early 1900s, the testimonials of people about what happened to their lands in the Kingcome Inlet, where Adam was spent a lot of his life. A man named McKay came to build his house, and he took for himself the land where our forefathers always got their food, where the women used to take the roots out of the ground. In other words, the Tequila root gardens. And he let his cows loose in their fields, and he banned people. When the women went down to dig roots, he took their digging sticks and threw them away. He cut down the crabapple trees and just generally excluded them from areas where they had been very carefully tended for a long time. And even now, the Tequila root gardens don't belong to officially to the Tsawadane people at Kingcome, but a lot of them belong to the Nature Conservancy and other environmental groups like Ducks Unlimited. So this is part of the same testimony. Apart from this place was the growth of the trees where the crab apples grow. White man came and cut all that down, and the women gave up that also. They got tired. It was useless going there anymore to gather these fruits. These two foods that I have described are now destroyed entirely by the white man, and these foods were valued very much. And not only were they valued, but they were really carefully tended and looked after and kept. And of course, this story is so sad, given what's happened in this last year and the flooding that's occurred. A lot of it is due to what happened in this so-called reclamation of the Sumas Lake in the Fraser Valley. This was once a lake. And in the after World War I, a lot of the First Nations from the Stolo area, the children went away to residential school. When they came back, their lake was gone. It was drained without permission. They just built these canals, the Vetter Canal, and they were trying to reclaim this land for agriculture. And they didn't take in any account of what was living there already, that this was an important habitat, a cultural habitat for the First Nations of the area. And you hear people talk about that now, since this whole area that was the lake is now reflooded and is in some cases still in flood. This is what it looks like, or looked like before this last fall. We went there with our class. I went to a little fruit stand right near there, and I asked them, "Do you know where Sumas Lake used to be?" And the woman there didn't have a clue, but a young Stolo boy was there, and he said, "You're standing in it." And I went out and I took this picture. This is what it looked like. This is where the lake was. It looked pretty run down, and it wasn't really being used for very much. It wasn't nearly as productive as it was before, when it was a sockeye spawning area. It's so ironic. Mary talked about how everything is deteriorating. In fact, we have a chapter in our book on the Secwepemc ethnobotanical research that Mary's the first author on, and it's called Everything is Deteriorating. It's really sad to think about these things, but it's really important also to recognize what people are thinking and what they've observed. And that's the only way that we're going to make a positive difference. She says it's harder to find a birch now. I have to walk for miles before I can get a decent piece of bark. And then she talks about the Salmon River estuary and how the water's getting less and less. The lakes are getting drier, and our rivers, our creeks are almost totally gone. It's not feeding the lakes. The areas where the bulrush grew are disappearing. There's no more life left. The river, sorry, we'll go back. Where the river is right now, that was one big meadow. That was my meadow, the original. And they diverted it back and cut the meadow in half. That's from 2001. One of her favorite root vegetables, the hohokolos, the wapato. She used to go there with her grandmothers. Both grandmothers would wade out into the water and dig up the wapato and throw it to the bank. She and her brother and sister would pick it up, put it in a basket, and they'd take it home and have a big feast with the wapato. But it totally disappeared. And it was heartbreaking for Mary not to have that traditional root anymore, along with atsumats, the water parsnip. And similar things were happening all over the place. The camas beds around Victoria, another example of the impacts of the newcomers bringing their sheep and planting grass from other parts of the world and grazing their sheep there, and totally replacing the camas meadow. As Brenda Beckwith says in her PhD dissertation, quoting, areas put to the plow, turned to pasture, including many flourishing camas gardens. The number one vegetable, which is what Christopher Paul called it, was exterminated as if it were a weed. And that's not far from the truth. Our friend Hans Romer, many of you know Hans, when he first came to Victoria, he was walking down Cedar Hill Crossroad, and there was a really nice garden on the side of the hill by Mount Talney. It was full of camas, and he stopped to take a photo, and the woman came rushing out of the house, and she said, "Oh, don't take a picture yet. We're getting rid of those, and we're going to plant rhododendrons." And that was the mindset of the late 60s and 70s, and even a lot later than that. People are still clearing out natural wildflower areas and replanting with introduced garden species of various kinds. But you are all on the side of understanding how much we can make a difference in the work that we do with renewal and restoration and revitalization of our home places. And this is going on all over the place, but especially I see it happening at places like Deertrails. And we can revisit Aldo Leopold's land ethic, which was from the turn of the last century anyway. I'm not sure when he actually wrote Sand County Almanac, but it would have been right around 1900 or a little bit later. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. And that's as true today as it was back for Aldo Leopold. It was fun to visit where he lived back in Madison, Wisconsin, and see the work that's being done there in restoring the oak woodlands right on the university where he was, or near there. So honoring our home places and all the species that we share with them, that's what all of us are doing in our own way. Home is a shared space, as it should be. We need to honor the homes of our non-human relatives as we honor those of our human relatives. Our home places intermingle, and it is the relationships that make them so special and so valued. we need to think of the future homes for our children and grandchildren and the future generations of all living things, up to seven generations and more. And there's my friend Lee Joseph Stilewatt, who did her master's work working with Lichen, which is the northern rice root, and restoring the northern rice root in the estuary of the Squamish River, her own home community, where her dad, Chief Floyd Joseph, is one of the leaders. She's just completing her PhD now, and she's been a leader all along in this area. And we can think about a few concepts like the idea of a cultural keystone place, or cultural keystone species, or cultural keystone place, places that are highly salient and have a great value to people, reflected in their fundamental role, past and present, for resource use or processing or food security or intergroup exchange, ceremonial activities. And one of these places is the Salmon River estuary that Mary Thomas talked about so lovingly. And if we think about these places and how they've changed and how we can work to restore their integrity, I think that would be a place to start. And so some years ago, we went back after Mary had passed away, but Anne Garibaldi, some of you know, was my master's student and is now was the co-founder of Integral Ecology, and which is a consulting company. And she did her master's working with Mary and learning about the Wapato, or the Hokokolos. And as part of her project, she restored populations of this plant to the Salmon River estuary. So after Mary passed away, we went back there. They were doing some restoration work. And sure enough, there where Anne had planted the Wapato, it was growing and flourishing in different places around the estuary. And there's Anne and Mary's daughter, Bonnie Thomas. So happy to see that Wapato intact there. So that's just an example. And of course, I couldn't finish this talk without recognizing our dear friend Trevor and all that you and Curtis and your community have done to look after your home place, as we've heard in your own talk, and helping to educate others. And I appreciate that so much. And this is the slide I said, you wait until you see. I just read this today on Twitter. Thought I'd share it with you. Spain passes new law to make pets legal family members. Spain just passed a new rule focusing on animal welfare. From January 5th, 2022, pets are no longer an object, but sentient beings, according to the court of law. So that's pretty neat. Your purple, your dear purple and your dear pup now, Trevor, are indeed sentient beings.
Certainly are.
So thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoyed the photos as well.